All right, y'all. So before we go any further, if you have not subscribed to this channel, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and don't forget to add your comments under this section below and hit that notification bell when new videos are dropped every Sunday at 1 o'clock in the morning. Okay, y'all. So today we're going to check out James Brown, one of the most legendary of King Funk and King of Soul music. And yeah, with that being said, let's go ahead and check this out. And make sure y'all follow my TikTok page. The link will also be under the description down below. And I will also drop this video. I will also drop the James Brown video also on TikTok as well. But without further ado, let's go ahead and check out James Brown and some of his greatest moments of music. My bad, y'all.
Fella playing guitar with a bottleneck around his finger.
Man, when you talk about legends, you gotta mention James Brown. They called him the godfather of soul, the man who could turn any stage into fire, the hardest working man in show business. But here's the crazy part. How can somebody who shaped funk, soul, and even hip-hop still feel underrated in the bigger picture of music history? James Brown wasn't just a singer. He was a movement, a symbol of power, of pride, of survival. He went from nothing to global icon, yet his story is full of chaos, battles, and pain the world never fully understood. So why did a man who gave so much never get all the respect he deserved? Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. James Brown's story didn't begin with the spotlight or the screaming crowds. It started in the harshest corners of the South during 1933. Born in Barnwell, South Carolina, James came into a world where poverty wasn't just a struggle, it was a way of life. His parents, Susie and Joseph Joe Gardner Brown, lived on the margins, and from the very beginning, James knew what it meant to fight for survival. His family moved around constantly, chasing work and stability that never seemed to stick. Before he was even old enough to understand music, he was already learning the sound of hardship, the creak of old floorboards, the growl of an empty stomach, the whispers of adults wondering how they'd make it to tomorrow. Things went from bad to worse when his mother left the family. For James, the absence of his mother was like a permanent scar. He was barely a kid, yet he had to grow up fast. His father, who struggled to provide, often left James to fend for himself. With no real home and very little love, the boy learned early on that life wasn't going to hand him anything. If he wanted to eat, he had to hustle. If he wanted respect, he had to fight for it. That's how James Brown started on the streets, not the stage. Man, picture this, a little kid, maybe 7 or 8, shining shoes on the sidewalks, dancing for coins, trying to scrape together a few pennies so he could buy food. Sometimes he sang, sometimes he just begged, but he was always moving, always working. He carried the burden of hunger and poverty, but he carried it with rhythm. Even then, there was something about him, something electric that made people stop and watch. But growing up black in the segregated South of the 1940 wasn't just tough, it was dangerous. Racism wasn't some distant concept, it was daily reality. James saw it in the way his family was treated, in the limits placed on his opportunities, in the way people looked at him like his life was worth less. Those experiences carved something deep into his soul, a need to prove himself, to rise above, to shout his worth so loud the world couldn't ignore it. The lack of stability pushed him into trouble. Without guidance, James drifted into petty crime. By his early teens, he was arrested for stealing, a desperate move that landed him in a juvenile detention center. Some people would have crumbled right there, but for James, this was another kind of school, the school of survival. Locked away, he learned discipline. And though it was painful, it gave him something he hadn't had before, structure. So from the very start, James Brown's life was no fairy tale. It was tough, it was lonely, and it was unfair. But out of all that struggle, a fire was burning. The same hardships that could have broken him were quietly shaping him into the man who would one day change music forever. Locked inside that juvenile detention center in the early 1940s, James Brown discovered something that would transform his life music. Man, you got to imagine it. Concrete walls, strict rules, no freedom. And yet in the middle of all that bleakness, James found rhythm. He joined the prison's gospel group, clapping hands, stomping feet, singing spirituals that lifted the spirit even when the world outside seemed cruel. For the first time, his voice wasn't just about begging for coins, it was about commanding attention, moving people, giving them chills. He soaked up every note, every melody, like a starving man finding food. Gospel gave him soul, rhythm and blues gave him grit, and the streets gave him swagger. James realized that sound could be power, that a voice, when used right, could open doors no key could unlock. He once said that without music, he probably wouldn't have survived. And man, you can feel that truth in every scream, every shout, every growl he put into a song later on. When he got out, James didn't go back to being just another hustler. He had a mission now. He'd walk through neighborhoods, singing at local gatherings, anywhere folks would listen. Churches, street corners, talent shows he treated every spot like Madison Square Garden. People started whispering about this wild kid with the fire in his lungs. He wasn't polished, but he had raw energy, the kind that makes you stop whatever you're doing and stare. One of the biggest turning points came when he crossed paths with Bobby Bird, a young singer who recognized the spark in James. Bird's family practically took him in, offering the kind of stability he hadn't known since he was a child. That bond would change everything. Through Bird, James stepped into a real music group, eventually joining what would become the famous Flames. Suddenly, he wasn't just a boy trying to survive, he was part of a crew, a unit, a brotherhood built on sound. And here's the wild part. Even before he had a hit, James Brown carried himself like a star. He practiced endlessly, rehearsed every move, worked on his voice until it was sharp like a blade. He knew he didn't have the privilege of talent alone. He had to outwork everybody, prove that his past didn't define his future. That hunger, born from poverty and pain, became the heartbeat of his style. So out of prison walls and church pews, James Brown discovered the gift that would take him from the dirt roads of South Carolina to stages across the globe. Music wasn't just something he loved, it was his escape, his identity, his weapon. And man, once James found that rhythm, the world didn't stand a chance. By the mid-1950, James Brown wasn't just a kid with raw talent anymore, he was a young man chasing a dream that seemed impossible. With Bobby Bird by his side, James stepped into the world of professional music. The group that would later be known as the famous Flames gave him his first real stage, and man, when James hit that mic, you could already feel the difference. He wasn't the smooth crooner type. Nah, James brought fire. He'd drop to his knees, scream like his soul was on the line, sweat pouring down his face as if every note might be his last. The first big break came in 1956 with the single Please, Please, Please. At first, some record executives thought it was too raw, too unpolished. But when James let loose in the studio, stretching out that please until it felt like heartbreak itself, it was undeniable. The record dropped on Federal Records, and to everyone's shock, it sold like crazy, over 1 million copies. Suddenly, the boy who once danced for pennies on the street had a hit playing on radios across America. But success didn't mean comfort. In fact, those early years were a grind. The famous Flames had to hustle city to city, club to club, piling into vans, playing one-nighters, sometimes not even getting paid. James, though, refused to slow down. He drilled the group like a general. Rehearsals were strict. Every dance move had to hit at the same time. Every note had to be perfect. Some called him demanding, even harsh. But that discipline gave them an edge that nobody else had. They weren't just a band, they were a show. And that show was electric. Audiences had never seen anything like James Brown. He'd spin, drop into splits, toss the mic stand and catch it like it was part of the beat. The crowd went wild, man. Women screamed, men shouted, and people left the venue knowing they had just witnessed something unforgettable. That's when James Brown started being called the hardest working man in show business. He gave everything, night after night, as if he had to earn his spot on that stage all over again. Still, recognition from the mainstream was slow. Critics often brushed him off as too much, too emotional, too raw compared to polished stars of the day. But that same rawness made him magnetic. Black audiences especially saw themselves in James, the struggle, the passion, the refusal to be ignored. His music spoke to survival, to resilience, to pride. So those first steps, please, 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 the endless touring, the sweat-soaked suits set the foundation for everything to come. James Brown wasn't just building a career, he was building a revolution in sound and performance. The world was just starting to notice, but man, they had no idea how big this wild boy from South Carolina was about to get. As the late 1950 rolled into the early 1960, James Brown started shaping a sound that didn't quite fit into the neat boxes of R&B or gospel. Man, he was cooking up something new, something raw, something that felt like pure electricity. The famous Flames gave him a bass, but James was the engine always pushing, always experimenting. Instead of focusing only on melody, he leaned into rhythm. Every instrument became part of the beat. The horns punched like jabs, the guitars chopped like knives, the drums drove everything forward, and James's voice sat on top like a preacher, like a drill sergeant, like a man testifying his soul. Crowds had never heard anything like it. Songs like Try Me in 1958 and Think in 1960 weren't just ballads or dance tunes, they were showcases of James Brown's control over emotion and groove. He had this way of stretching out a single word, repeating it, twisting it until it became less about lyrics and more about feeling. You didn't just hear James, you felt him, deep in your chest. And that became the signature, the scream, the growl, the shout that made you believe every word. But James didn't stop at the sound, he revolutionized the stage. The suits, the sweat, the cape routine where he'd pretend to collapse only to spring back with even more fire, that was all James Brown. He turned concerts into theater, into ritual, into pure spectacle. He trained his band with military precision, fining members if they missed a note, making sure the entire show ran like a machine. Some thought he was too strict, but the result was undeniable. Tight, powerful, unforgettable performances. Behind it all was a vision. James wanted to break the mold of what black entertainers were supposed to be. At a time when segregation was still alive and opportunities were limited, he carved out his own lane. His music and his presence screamed pride, strength, and independence. By focusing on rhythm and energy, he laid down the foundation of funk even before the word funk was widely used to describe a genre. And man, the people responded. Black audiences across the country claimed James as their own. He wasn't trying to cross over or soften his edges for mainstream approval, he was doubling down on his identity. That raw honesty became his weapon, his shield, and his legacy. So while other artists chased pop trends, James Brown was busy building something timeless. Piece by piece, groove by groove, he was becoming the architect of a whole new sound. The godfather of soul was stepping into his kingdom, and the world was about to feel the full force of James Brown's style. By the mid-1960s, James Brown had gone from local sensation to a national powerhouse. But man, the real explosion came when he broke through with songs that didn't just climb the charts, they rewrote the rulebook of popular music. In 1965, Papa's Got a Brand New Bag hit the airwaves, and everything shifted. That track wasn't just a hit, it was a declaration. The horns stabbed like lightning. The groove was stripped down to pure rhythm, and James's voice commanded every beat. It won him a Grammy and shot him to the top of the R&B charts, proving once and for all that his too raw, too different style was exactly what people wanted. Hot on its heels came I Got You, I Feel Good. That song became his anthem, the scream, the punchy horns, the sheer joy bursting through the speakers. It was impossible not to move when it played. Even today, you can drop that track at a party and watch people light up. With those records, James Brown wasn't just a singer anymore, he was a force of nature, the man who gave soul music its swagger. But what made James different wasn't just the hits, it was the impact. His music started crossing borders. In Europe, audiences who barely understood the words still felt the fire. In Africa, his rhythms connected with traditional grooves, inspiring a generation of Afrobeat artists like Fela Kuti. In America, he wasn't just entertaining, he was empowering. When James Brown shouted on stage, people felt it as a call to stand tall, to be proud of who they were. And then there was the showmanship. Man, James Brown live in the mid-1960s was a sight to behold. The Apollo Theater became his temple, and the 1963 album Live at the Apollo proved it. Critics called it one of the greatest live recordings ever made, capturing the sweat, the screams, the energy of a man giving his soul to the crowd. From then on, James Brown concerts weren't just gigs, they were life-changing experiences. As the 1970 arrived, James was unstoppable. Get up, I feel like being a sex machine, turned the groove into something hypnotic. Superbad, Hot Pants, The Payback. These weren't just songs, they were blueprints for funk. Every rapper, every producer decades later would go digging into those beats, those riffs, those shouts. The DNA of hip-hop itself can be traced straight back to James Brown's music. But here's the thing, while he was shaping global culture, mainstream recognition still came with a side of disrespect. Rock critics, mostly white at the time, often dismissed him as a showman rather than a true musician, ignoring the genius of his rhythmic innovations. Yet behind the scenes, every major artist was taking notes. Michael Jackson borrowed the footwork, Prince borrowed the attitude, Mick Jagger borrowed the stage energy. They all knew who the real master was. By the time James Brown was touring the world, he wasn't just a singer, he was an ambassador of a new sound. From New York to London, from Lagos to Tokyo, his name carried the weight of revolution. The world had to admit it. James Brown had gone global, and there was no turning back. James Brown's music wasn't just about the groove, it was about the message. By the late 1960s, America was boiling with social change, and James wasn't about to stay silent. In 1968, just months after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he released Say It Loud, I'm Black, and I'm Proud. Man, that wasn't just a song, it was an anthem. Kids were shouting it in the streets, adults were chanting it in rallies, and suddenly James Brown wasn't just the godfather of soul, he was the soundtrack to the civil rights movement. His words gave power to a generation that was told to sit down and stay quiet. He told them to stand tall. But here's the crazy part. While James was lifting up his people, the mainstream often tried to tear him down. White radio stations hesitated to play Say It Loud, calling it too political. Critics labeled him a rabble-rouser instead of a visionary. Some even said his music was just noise, ignoring the genius behind his rhythm-driven style. Imagine that James Brown, the man whose grooves built the backbone of modern music, dismissed as noise. That's wild. Still, his influence couldn't be denied. He inspired not just musicians, but movements. Young black kids saw him on TV, saw his confidence, and realized they didn't have to apologize for who they were. Activists quoted his lyrics. DJs spun his records like sermons, and whole communities leaned on his voice for strength. Internationally, his reach stretched even further. In Africa, leaders invited him to perform because his music spoke to liberation struggles. Fela Kuti, the Nigerian pioneer of Afrobeat, often credited James Brown as a massive influence on his sound and his political message. And yet, while others borrowed from him, James often didn't get the same credit. Rock and roll historians wrote page after page about Elvis, the Beatles, or the Rolling Stones, but James's contributions were often footnotes. Never mind that the Rolling Stones literally opened for James Brown early in their career, or that countless bands stole pieces of his style. The industry made fortunes off his innovations while calling him too raw. That's the injustice. He was the foundation, but they built the house without inviting him inside. Even in awards and recognition, James was shortchanged. Sure, he won some Grammys and eventually got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but many argued it was too little, too late. By the time the establishment recognized him, his influence had already been shaping music for decades. And when you compare the respect given to artists like Elvis, it becomes clear. James Brown was never celebrated on the same level, even though his impact was arguably just as big, if not bigger. But no amount of dismissal could erase his footprint. The funk, the rhythm, the soul, those belonged to James. His innovations fueled disco, birthed hip-hop, and electrified pop. And the message? It still rings out today. Say It Loud wasn't just about 1968. It was about every generation learning to be proud of who they are. So yeah, James Brown influenced the world. But the injustice is this. He never got all the flowers he deserved while he was alive. The establishment might have tried to minimize him, but history knows the truth. For all the fire James Brown brought to the stage, his personal life was filled with storms that never seemed to calm down. Man, the same intensity that made him unstoppable in music, also haunted him off the stage. He demanded perfection, not just from his band, but from the people closest to him, and that pressure often turned into conflict. Let's start with his marriages. James was married multiple times, and almost every relationship carried heavy turbulence. Stories of infidelity, jealousy, and even abuse began to surface. His partners often described him as controlling, a man who lived by his own rules and expected everyone else to follow. Some accusations of domestic violence tarnished his image, painting a darker picture of the godfather of soul. To the public, James Brown was a hero, but behind closed doors, he could be volatile, struggling to manage the weight of fame, stress, and his own demons. Then came the drugs. Like many artists of his era, James turned to substances to keep up with the demands of constant touring, recording, and performing. Cocaine became a shadow in his life, feeding into his mood swings and erratic behavior. Man, imagine performing hundreds of shows a year, running a band like a general, and carrying the expectations of millions of fans. It wore him down. Drugs offered temporary relief, but they also fueled the chaos, leading to arrests, breakdowns, and public scandals that would follow him for decades. Money, too, became a battlefield. Even though James Brown sold millions of records and packed out venues across the world, he often found himself tangled in financial trouble. Bad business deals, shady managers, and his own spending habits drained his fortune. He invested in radio stations and real estate, trying to build an empire, but not all of those ventures paid off. IRS troubles would hound him repeatedly, and the press loved to highlight his financial struggles, as if rooting for the downfall of a man who had given so much to music. And then there was the law. James Brown had a reputation for running things his way on the road, in business, and in life. That meant clashes with authority were inevitable. From speeding tickets to gun possession charges, his rap sheet grew over time. One of the lowest points came in the late 1980 when he was arrested after a high-speed police chase, leading to a 6-year prison sentence, though he served less than 3. For a man who lived for the stage, being locked away again felt like reliving his painful youth. Through it all, James Brown never stopped working. Even in his darkest moments, he returned to the stage like it was his sanctuary. But the personal struggles took a toll on his health, his relationships, and his reputation. Fans who idolized his music couldn't ignore the headlines that painted him as unpredictable, dangerous, or unstable. The truth is, James Brown lived with a dual reality. On stage, he was larger than life, the master of funk and soul. Off stage, he was a man haunted by anger, addiction, and the pressures of being a pioneer who carried the weight of an entire culture. That contradiction between brilliance and brokenness defined so much of his journey. By the late 1970 and into the 1980, James Brown's once unstoppable career began to show cracks. The same man who had set the world on fire with funk now found himself struggling to stay relevant in an industry that was changing fast. Disco was on the rise, hip-hop was just starting to emerge, and James, though he had laid the foundation for both, was suddenly being seen as yesterday's sound. Man, that had to sting. Imagine being the architect of the groove, only to watch younger artists run with your blueprint, while the industry labeled you old school. Still, James tried to adapt. He experimented with disco-leaning tracks and even dipped into more electronic sounds in the 1980s. His 1985 hit Living in America gave him a brief resurgence, especially with its appearance in Rocky IV. That performance reminded the world of his star power, but it was more of a comeback moment than a true revival. By then, James was battling more than just musical trends, he was fighting himself. The controversies piled up. His drug use became harder to hide, leading to erratic public behavior. In 1988, he was arrested after a bizarre high-speed chase that started when he stormed into an insurance seminar with a shotgun, claiming strangers were using his restroom without permission. What followed was pure chaos. A police pursuit across 2 states, tire spikes, and finally James being taken down and sentenced to prison. Headlines screamed the downfall of the godfather of soul. and suddenly his genius was overshadowed by mugshots and courtroom drama. Prison time marked one of the lowest chapters of his life. Though he was released early, the damage to his image was heavy. He became a tabloid figure, with every arrest, every scandal splashed across the news. Domestic issues resurfaced as well, with further accusations of abuse and volatile behavior making headlines. For many younger fans, James Brown was no longer the revolutionary performer. They only knew him as a troubled star with a messy personal life. And yet, even in decline, James never gave up the stage. He still performed, still toured, still gave everything he had to audiences who remained loyal. Those who saw him live in the 1990 and 2000 said he could still light up a room like nobody else. The splits weren't as sharp, the screams not as long, but the energy, the soul was still there. Man, it was like watching a warrior battle time itself. But the controversies never stopped chasing him. Lawsuits over royalties, fights over money, constant run-ins with the law. His later years were a storm. Health problems started creeping in too, but James refused to slow down. The hardest working man in show business was still grinding, even when his body begged him to rest. That's the tragedy of James Brown's decline. For every headline about his genius, there were two about his chaos. For every reminder of his influence, there was another story about his downfall. It was as if the world couldn't decide whether to crown him or crucify him. And through it all, James kept dancing, kept shouting, kept giving his soul because that's all he knew how to do. When you look past the chaos, the scandals, and the pain, what remains is James Brown's undeniable cultural legacy. Man, this dude didn't just make music, he changed the very DNA of sound. They called him the godfather of soul, but his influence stretched way beyond soul. He was the architect of funk, the blueprint for hip-hop, the backbone of R&B, and the spark that lit pop and rock performances on fire. Think about it. Before James Brown, rhythm was part of the music. After James Brown, rhythm was the music. He stripped songs down to their essence, turning every instrument into percussion, every horn stab into punctuation, every shout into an instrument of its own. That innovation birthed funk, and funk birthed everything from disco to modern rap. Without James Brown, half the grooves you hear today wouldn't even exist. And then there's the sampling. In the 1980 and 1990, hip-hop producers cracked open his records and found a goldmine. The breakbeat from Funky Drummer, played by Clyde Stubblefield, became one of the most sampled sounds in history. From Public Enemy to Run, DMC, from Dr. Dre to Kendrick Lamar, James Brown's fingerprints are all over hip-hop. Entire generations built their music careers on top of his beats. That's legacy, man. That's immortality. But it wasn't just about sound, it was about spirit. James Brown represented black pride and resilience in a way few entertainers ever had. Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. Wasn't just a song, it was a cultural statement that still echoes today. In times of struggle, his music gave people strength. In times of joy, it gave them a reason to dance. He proved that music could be both political and personal, both protest and party. Globally, his influence was just as strong. In Africa, he was embraced as a symbol of liberation, inspiring Fela Kuti and fueling the Afrobeat movement. In Europe and Asia, his concerts drew massive crowds who didn't need to know English to understand the rhythm. His sound transcended language, transcended borders. It was human at its core. And let's not forget performance. Every time you see an artist command the stage with dance, with precision, with theatrical energy, you're seeing James Brown's shadow. Michael Jackson, Prince, Bruno Mars, they all borrowed pieces of his fire. Even rock legends like Mick Jagger admitted they studied James's moves. He wasn't just a singer. He was a teacher, a showman, a master who raised the standard for what live music could be. So when we talk about James Brown's cultural legacy, it's not just about hits or awards. It's about transformation. He didn't follow trends, he created them. He didn't fit in boxes, he broke them. And decades after his passing, his music, his moves, his message still live on in every rhythm-driven sound you hear today. For all his impact, James Brown remains one of the most underrated geniuses in music history. Sounds wild, right? How can the godfather of soul, the man who redefined rhythm, still be seen as overlooked? but that's the truth. While names like Elvis Presley, the Beatles, and even Michael Jackson are constantly celebrated as cultural giants, James often gets left in the shadows, mentioned less in the all-time greatest conversations, despite the fact that his influence runs just as deep, if not deeper. Part of it comes down to how the industry treated him. Critics often dismissed him as a showman, more about sweat and spectacle than artistry. They wrote about his screams, his spins, his splits, while ignoring the revolutionary way he structured music. James wasn't just singing, he was deconstructing songs, stripping away unnecessary layers, and rebuilding them around rhythm and repetition. That approach laid the foundation for modern genres, but because it didn't fit the traditional idea of melody and harmony, many serious critics didn't get it. Then there's the question of recognition. Sure, James eventually got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, won Grammys, and was honored in documentaries, but those flowers often came late, after decades of shaping music behind the scenes. Meanwhile, others who borrowed heavily from his style, whether in performance, sound, or swagger, were lifted higher in mainstream narratives. That's the injustice. James was the source, but history books often treated him like a footnote, and yet, his genius is everywhere. Listen to hip-hop. Thousands of songs carry his samples. Listen to funk and R&B. His DNA runs through every groove. Watch any major pop star hit the stage with tight choreography and explosive energy. You're seeing James Brown's playbook. From Prince to Bruno Mars, his spirit lives on in performers who built careers following his template. Even if people don't always realize it, they're witnessing the echo of James Brown every time the beat drops and the crowd loses its mind. Fans know it too. Ask anyone who saw him live, and they'll tell you he wasn't just an entertainer, he was a force of nature, a genius of timing, rhythm, and intensity. The way he commanded both the stage and the band was unmatched. He didn't just perform songs, he turned them into living, breathing events that left audiences changed. That kind of mastery should have put him permanently at the top of every greatest of all time list. So yeah, James Brown might not always get the credit he deserves in the mainstream, but the truth is undeniable. He was a genius, misunderstood by critics, overshadowed by history, but immortalized by the very music we listen to today. If genius is about changing the world in ways no one else could, then James Brown was one of the greatest to ever do it. James Brown's life was a story of contradictions, brilliance and chaos, triumph and tragedy, glory and pain. He was born into nothing, raised in hardship, and yet climbed to heights most people could never imagine. He gave the world a sound it had never heard before, a performance style that rewrote the rules, and an energy that still vibrates through music today. And yet, man, even with all that, James Brown was often underestimated, underappreciated, and misunderstood. Think about it. He was the man who laid the foundation for funk, who shaped the rhythms that gave birth to hip-hop, who inspired legends like Michael Jackson and Prince. But when people list the greatest artists of all time, his name doesn't always roll off the tongue first. That's the injustice that makes his story both inspiring and heartbreaking. He changed the world, but the world didn't always give him the crown he deserved. And maybe that's why his story hit so hard. James Brown was human flawed, wild, sometimes self-destructive, but he was also larger than life, carrying the pride of a people and the pulse of a generation. He showed that even when society tries to hold you down, you can shout so loud, dance so hard, and live so fiercely that they can't ignore you forever. That's why fans call him not just the hardest working man in show business, but a king who reigned on his own terms. So here's the question. Man, does James Brown deserve to stand shoulder to shoulder with Elvis Presley, the Beatles, or Michael Jackson as one of the most important figures in music history? Or maybe, just maybe, he deserves even more credit than all of them, because without his blueprint, none of their sounds would have been the same. What do y'all think? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this debate matters. One thing is certain. James Brown's name might not always get shouted in the history books the way it should, but in the hearts of those who truly understand music, he is eternal. Every time a beat drops, every time a groove makes you move, every time an artist commands a stage with fire, you're witnessing the spirit of James Brown. His story is a reminder that genius isn't always clean, perfect, or celebrated in its own time. Sometimes it's messy, raw, and underrated. But that doesn't make it any less powerful. James Brown may have left this world in 2006, but the godfather of soul lives on louder, prouder, and funkier than ever.
All right, y'all. If y'all enjoyed that video, leave a like once again and let me know who is your favorite R&B singer from the 80s, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, or 90s. And yeah, y'all. This is Flame 101 signing out. Peace.